Blinding studio lights beat down on the polished stage like an interrogation room designed for maximum exposure. Every seat in the audience was filled. 300 people who had applied for tickets the moment the network announced this special broadcast. Camera operators positioned themselves at strategic angles, their lenses hungry for the moment everyone had tuned in to witness. Robert Ashford stood at the center podium, his custom Italian suit worth more than most people's annual salaries. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, never been denied, never experienced a moment of genuine consequence. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set in an expression of righteous certainty. A triumphant smirk played at the corners of his lips as he surveyed the audience. His audience, gathered to witness his victory. Beside him, positioned slightly lower in a chair that seemed deliberately chosen to diminish her, Sandra Ashford sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her posture was impeccable, her navy dress elegant but understated. At 48, she remained beautiful in a way that suggested careful maintenance, the kind of beauty expected of a billionaire's wife. Her expression, however, was unreadable. Not angry, not afraid, simply present. A representative from Gene Truth Laboratories stood at a secondary podium holding a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with significance under the studio lights. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the company's chief geneticist, had performed thousands of paternity reveals on daytime talk shows. This one was different. Primetime, national broadcast, a Fortune 500 family. She'd expected nervous energy from the couple. Instead, she'd found Robert practically vibrating with anticipation and Sandra exhibiting an almost unsettling calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, his voice carrying the practiced gravity of a man who understood ratings, "the moment of truth has arrived." Robert leaned into his microphone. "Finally, let everyone see exactly what kind of woman I married." Dr. Coleman opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the results, and something shifted in her expression. Loss of color first, then confusion, then a rapid succession of micro-expressions that broadcast professionals would later analyze frame by frame. She turned to the producers standing just off camera, engaged in a whispered exchange that stretched for 15 agonizing seconds. Robert's smirk faltered. "Well, read the results. We don't have all night." Dr. Coleman returned to the microphone, cleared her throat, and spoke with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Mr. Ashford, the paternity test confirms that you are the biological father of your son, Marcus." Robert's smirk exploded into a full smile. He turned toward Sandra, expecting tears, expecting collapse, expecting the public humiliation he'd orchestrated. But Dr. Coleman continued. "However, the expanded DNA analysis revealed an unexpected anomaly in your genetic profile." She paused, and in that pause, the entire studio held its breath. "Your DNA indicates that Harold Ashford Sr. is not your biological father." Silence. Complete, absolute silence, the kind that seems to consume sound itself. Robert's face underwent a transformation that would haunt him in screenshots and memes for years to come. The triumphant smile froze, then shattered. His eyes widened with incomprehension. His knees buckled, and Robert Ashford, CEO of Ashford Pharmaceuticals, heir to a $2.3 billion fortune, the man who had never experienced genuine defeat, collapsed to the stage floor. The audience gasped. Cameras zoomed in, production assistants rushed forward, and Sandra Ashford didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't rush to her husband's side. Her hands remained folded. Her posture remained perfect. Her expression remained exactly what it had been since the broadcast began. Unreadable. Almost eerily calm. Ashford Pharmaceuticals occupied a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the city's ambition back at itself. For 4 decades, the company had been a Fortune 500 mainstay, its medications in medicine cabinets across America, its stock a reliable performer that had made early investors wealthy beyond imagination. Harold Ashford Sr. had built this empire from a single patent and an unwavering belief in his own vision. Now 84 and dying of pancreatic cancer, he lay in the master bedroom of his Connecticut estate, surrounded by antique furniture, priceless art, and the accumulated weight of decisions he could no longer undo. The estate itself sprawled across 40 acres of manicured grounds, gardens designed by landscape architects, a stable that housed horses nobody rode anymore, a guest house larger than most American homes. It was the kind of wealth that existed almost as performance, a constant demonstration of success that had somehow become the Ashford family's substitute for genuine connection. Robert Ashford had spent 52 years as the crown prince of this kingdom. From childhood, he'd been groomed for inheritance, the best schools, the right connections, a corner office waiting for him before he'd proven he deserved it. He became CEO not through merit, but through blood right, ascending to the position his father had always intended for him. The employees at Ashford Pharmaceuticals had learned to navigate Robert's management style through a combination of flattery and invisibility. He treated them like servants, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. His temper was legendary, his grudges eternal, his capacity for cruelty seemingly bottomless, yet none of them dared speak against him. He was the heir. One day, all of this would be his. Or so everyone believed. Harold Ashford's legacy extended beyond Robert, though the family rarely acknowledged it publicly. 40 years ago, during a period of marital strain that the Ashfords had never discussed, Harold had engaged in an affair with his secretary, Margaret Mercer. The affair lasted 8 months and produced a son, Daniel, born in a modest hospital across town, while Robert enjoyed private pediatric care in the family's preferred facility. Harold had acknowledged Daniel in his own limited way. There was a trust fund, carefully structured to provide comfort without excess. There was a surname, Mercer, not Ashford, that marked Daniel as separate, lesser, other. And there was a position at Ashford Pharmaceuticals, a middle management role in logistics that utilized perhaps a tenth of Daniel's actual capabilities. Now 43, Daniel Mercer had spent his entire life in his half-brother's shadow. He'd inherited Harold's intelligence and business instincts, his mother's work ethic and quiet dignity. He'd watched Robert squander opportunities Daniel would have treasured, seen promotions go to less qualified candidates because Robert blocked his advancement, endured decades of casual cruelty that ranged from snide comments to outright humiliation. Bastard was Robert's favorite term for Daniel. He used it in private conversations, in family dinners, occasionally in board meetings when he wanted to remind everyone of the hierarchy. Daniel had learned to absorb these attacks without visible reaction, which only infuriated Robert more. He wanted Daniel broken, diminished, constantly reminded of his inferior status. What Robert never understood was that Daniel's dignity wasn't performance, it was armor, and armor, properly maintained, could outlast any siege. Sandra Chen had been 25 when she met Robert Ashford at a charity gala. She came from a respectable family, her father a professor, her mother a librarian, with modest means and genuine values. She was beautiful, intelligent, well-spoken, exactly the kind of woman Robert wanted displayed on his arm. He'd pursued her with the intensity of a man acquiring a valuable asset. Flowers, jewelry, romantic gestures that Sandra would later recognize as performances rather than genuine affection. She'd been young enough to mistake intensity for love, confident enough in her own judgment to believe she could see the good in him others missed. 23 years later, she understood her error completely. Robert had never wanted a partner. He'd wanted an accessory, someone educated enough to charm at parties but submissive enough to defer to his judgment on everything that mattered. When Sandra expressed opinions, he dismissed them. When she suggested alternatives, he belittled her intelligence. When she tried to build a life outside his control, friendships, hobbies, independent thoughts, he systematically dismantled each attempt. He monitored her spending through their shared accounts, questioning purchases over $50. He tracked her location through her phone, demanding explanations for any deviation from expected patterns. He criticized her appearance, her weight, her clothing choices, her value as a wife and mother and human being. To the outside world, Sandra Ashford was a ghost, a beautiful accessory who smiled at appropriate moments and otherwise remained silent. To Robert, she was confirmation of his own superiority, a woman so thoroughly defeated she had ceased to fight. He had never been more wrong about anyone in his life. Harold Ashford drifted in and out of consciousness as autumn light filtered through his bedroom windows. The cancer had spread beyond treatment months ago. Now he simply waited, attended by private nurses and visited by lawyers finalizing paperwork that would determine the future of everything he'd built. His relationship with Robert troubled him in ways he'd never adequately addressed. He'd given his son every advantage: education, position, wealth, unwavering support. In return, he'd watched Robert become the kind of man Harold would never have tolerated as an employee, let alone celebrated as an heir. The cruelty toward Daniel was particularly painful to witness. Harold had failed Daniel in countless ways, had kept him at arm's length to protect his marriage, had never publicly acknowledged him as a son, had watched Robert's torment without intervention. These failures haunted him now as mortality stripped away the comfortable lies he'd told himself for decades. What kind of man had he raised? What kind of empire was he leaving behind? The will on his bedside table represented his final attempt to answer these questions. His lawyers had questioned some provisions, warned him of potential challenges, suggested safer alternatives. Harold had overruled them all. He was dying. He might as well die honestly. 3 days before the broadcast, Robert Ashford stormed into the family mansion like a man possessed. His face was flushed with righteous fury, his movements sharp and aggressive. In his hand, he clutched printouts, screenshots of text messages from Sandra's phone that he'd accessed without her knowledge. The weekly family dinner was already in progress. Harold sat at the head of the table, pale and diminished, but insisting on maintaining traditions. Eleanor, his wife of 60 years, sat at the opposite end, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested long practice. Daniel had been invited, as always, more obligation than genuine welcome, and sat quietly, focusing on his meal. Sandra had been mid-sentence describing a charity event she was helping organize when Robert burst through the dining room doors. "I want a DNA test," he announced, slamming the printouts onto the table. "I want to prove to everyone what you really are." Silence fell like a physical weight. Daniel set down his fork. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wineglass. Harold closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. Sandra looked at the printouts, her own text messages, private conversations with her college friend Claire about an upcoming reunion. Innocent exchanges that Robert's paranoia had twisted into evidence of betrayal. Robert, those texts are from my friend Claire," Sandra said, her voice remarkably steady. "We've known each other since freshman year. She's visiting next month to see her daughter at Columbia." "Lies!" Robert slammed his palm against the table, rattling silverware. "I've read between the lines. I know what 'can't wait to see you' really means. I know what you've been doing behind my back." "Robert, please." Harold's voice was weak, but carried the weight of paternal authority. "This is unnecessary. Family matters should remain private. Whatever concerns you have about your marriage can be addressed through proper channels." "No, Father. I want everyone to know the truth." Robert's eyes were wild with the certainty of a man who had never considered he might be wrong. "I've contacted a television producer, a network special. We're doing this publicly on live television where Sandra can't lie her way out of it." Daniel spoke quietly from his corner of the table. "Robert, maybe you should reconsider. Public spectacles rarely end well for anyone involved." "Shut up, bastard." The casual cruelty landed like a slap, silencing Daniel mid-sentence. "Nobody asked for the opinion of my father's mistake. This is family business, real family." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. 40 years of practice had taught him the futility of engaging with Robert's contempt. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Harold. Quick, loaded with meaning, carrying the weight of secrets kept for over 5 decades. Fear lived in that glance, and guilt, and the dawning recognition that carefully constructed lies were about to face their reckoning. Sandra watched this silent exchange with interest she carefully concealed. She had learned to read the Ashford family's hidden communications years ago. She understood exactly what that glance meant. "If you want this test, Robert," Sandra said finally, her voice carrying no fear, no anger, no pleading, "I won't stop you. Do what you need to do." Robert's triumphant expression flickered momentarily. He had expected resistance. Tears, begging, desperate attempts to talk him out of public humiliation. Sandra's calm acceptance unnerved him in ways he couldn't articulate, but his arrogance quickly reassured him. She had accepted her defeat. She knew she was caught and was simply resigned to the inevitable exposure. Her dignity in the face of destruction was admirable, perhaps, but ultimately meaningless. He would destroy her anyway. Later that night, after the household had retreated to their separate corners, Sandra walked calmly through the master bedroom she had shared with Robert for over 2 decades. She waited until his snoring confirmed deep sleep, then moved silently to her closet. Behind a rack of designer dresses Robert had chosen for her, Sandra pressed a hidden panel. The wall section swung open, revealing a narrow doorway that led to a small room, her private study, a space Robert didn't know existed. She had discovered this room during renovations 8 years ago, a forgotten servants' quarters that previous architects had sealed away. She'd bribed the contractor to restore it secretly, to add soundproofing, to install a lock only she could access. It had become her sanctuary, her war room, her proof that she was not the ghost Robert believed her to be. The study contained a desk, a comfortable chair, a small safe, and filing cabinets filled with documentation Robert would find devastating if he ever discovered their existence. Sandra sat at the desk, unlocked the safe, and removed a thick file folder. Inside, 5 years of genealogy research, DNA analysis results from multiple testing companies, family trees extending back generations, medical records obtained through creative means, private investigator reports documenting the life and death of Victor Castellano, and one document highlighted in yellow, the document that would change everything. Sandra had discovered the truth 3 years ago, almost by accident. She'd been researching her own family history through a popular genealogy website, curious about her Asian heritage and the relatives who had immigrated generations before. The website offered DNA matching services, connecting users with genetic relatives. On a whim, she'd submitted a sample from Robert, obtained from a coffee cup during a corporate health screening she'd encouraged him to attend. She'd told herself she was simply curious about the Ashford lineage, perhaps looking for genetic health markers that might affect their children. What she discovered instead was a complete absence of genetic connection between Robert Ashford and Harold Ashford Sr. The DNA matching algorithm had linked Robert to an unexpected paternal line, a Castellano family from Philadelphia, not the Ashford dynasty at all. Further investigation revealed Victor Castellano, a charismatic businessman who had died 15 years ago, whose path had crossed with Eleanor Ashford's during a precise window of time 53 years earlier. Sandra had hired private investigators, discreet professionals who knew how to dig without leaving traces. They'd confirmed the timeline, uncovered hotel receipts from the affair, even located an old photograph of Victor that revealed striking similarities to Robert's features. Eleanor's long-buried secret was not as buried as she believed. For 3 years, Sandra had sat with this knowledge, considering her options. She could reveal it herself, use it as leverage in a divorce negotiation, deploy it as a weapon when Robert's abuse became unbearable. Each option had been analyzed, wargamed, ultimately set aside. Because Sandra understood something Robert never would. The most elegant victories came from positioning, not attacking. From patience, not aggression. From letting your opponent defeat themselves while you simply waited. When Robert announced his intention to demand a public DNA test, Sandra recognized the moment she'd been preparing for. The comprehensive genetic analysis required for the television special would reveal everything. Robert would destroy himself on live television, and Sandra wouldn't have to lift a finger. She closed the folder, returned it to the safe, and allowed herself a small smile. Checkmate. The word hung in the air of her secret study, a promise, a prophecy, and a verdict all at once. Robert had spent 23 years underestimating her intelligence, dismissing her capabilities, believing he had married a beautiful accessory with no inner life worth considering. He was about to learn how wrong he had been. Sandra turned off the study light, sealed the hidden door, and returned to the bedroom where her husband snored in ignorant contentment. She slid beneath the covers with the calm of a woman who had already won a war her opponent didn't know was being fought. In 72 hours, the world would watch Robert Ashford's destruction, and Sandra would be there for every moment, expression perfectly unreadable, victory perfectly concealed. She had waited years for this. She could wait 3 more days. Promotional campaigns saturated every media platform for 72 hours before the broadcast. Network executives had recognized the ratings potential immediately. A billionaire family airing their dysfunction on live television was the kind of spectacle that transcended demographics, appealing to everyone from reality TV enthusiasts to serious news consumers who would never admit their interest. Billionaire heir demands public DNA test, accuses wife of infidelity. The headline appeared on bus shelters, digital billboards, and as pre-roll advertisements before every YouTube video. Entertainment news programs devoted entire segments to speculation. Talk show hosts debated Sandra's guilt with the confidence of people who had never met her. Robert Ashford cooperated enthusiastically with the promotional machine. He gave interviews to anyone who asked, painting himself as a wronged husband seeking only truth and accountability. His narrative was carefully constructed. The successful businessman who had given his wife everything, only to discover her betrayal. He spoke of trust violated, of sacred vows broken, of his determination to expose deception, regardless of personal cost. "I believe in transparency," Robert told one interviewer, his expression projecting wounded dignity. "When you suspect something is wrong in your marriage, you have two choices: ignore it and let the rot spread, or confront it directly. I've never been a man who avoids difficult truths." The interviewer nodded sympathetically. "And your wife? Has she responded to these allegations?" "Sandra has refused all interview requests," Robert said, allowing a small, knowing smile. "I think that tells you everything you need to know." Sandra's silence became evidence of her guilt in the court of public opinion. She declined every media inquiry, issued no statements, made no appearances. Social media filled the vacuum with speculation. #Ashford scandal trended nationally. The hashtag attached to thousands of posts, condemning a woman most people had never seen speak. "Silence equals guilt," one viral tweet declared. "Innocent people defend themselves. Sandra Ashford is hiding something." Sandra read this tweet from her hidden study, smiled slightly, and continued her preparations. Morning light filtered through the windows of the Ashford estate as Sandra stood before her closet, considering her options with the precision of a general selecting armor for battle. Every choice mattered. The color, the cut, the accessories, the message each element would convey to millions of viewers. She selected a navy dress, modest in cut, elegant without being ostentatious. The color suggested stability, trustworthiness, quiet dignity. She chose small pearl earrings, her grandmother's, carrying genuine sentimental value, and minimal makeup that emphasized her natural features without appearing calculated. Before the mirror, Sandra practiced expressions she had perfected over years of marriage to a man who scrutinized her every reaction. Quiet hurt, the subtle downturn of lips, the slight glistening in eyes. Restrained dignity, chin lifted slightly, posture perfect despite apparent emotional weight. Grace under fire, the ability to absorb attacks without crumbling, to maintain composure when lesser people would collapse. She was not preparing to defend herself. She was preparing to appear defeated while knowing victory was already assured. Across the estate, in the guest wing, Robert had claimed for pre-broadcast celebrations, a very different preparation was underway. Champagne corks popped at 10 in the morning. Robert's friends, the handful who still answered his calls, drawn more by proximity to wealth than genuine affection, gathered to toast his upcoming triumph. "After tonight," Robert announced, raising his glass, "the whole world will see what Sandra really is, and then I'll file for divorce. The prenup is ironclad. There's an infidelity clause. She gets nothing, not a penny of what she's enjoyed for 23 years. His lawyer, Benjamin Cross, stood apart from the celebration, his expression troubled. He'd attempted multiple times to inject caution into Robert's enthusiasm, each attempt dismissed with increasing irritation. "Robert," Benjamin tried again, pulling his client aside, "I need you to consider the possibility that this doesn't go as planned. If the test proves the child is yours—" "It's not about the child," Robert snapped, his champagne-fueled confidence allowing no doubt. "Marcus probably is mine. This is about showing everyone who Sandra really is, about proving she's been lying, sneaking around, making me look like a fool. The test will reveal something. It always does." "What if it doesn't reveal what you expect?" Robert laughed, the sound of a man who had never seriously contemplated defeat. "Benjamin, I've spent my entire life being right. Tonight will be no different." Benjamin said nothing more. He had learned, over years of representing Robert Ashford, that certain clients could not be protected from themselves. At 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before broadcast, Eleanor Ashford appeared at Sandra's dressing room door. The old woman looked every one of her 79 years, her carefully maintained appearance cracked by sleepless nights and mounting dread. Her hands trembled as Sandra admitted her. They had never been close, these two women bound by marriage to Ashford men. Eleanor had always maintained careful distance, treating Sandra with formal courtesy that never warmed into genuine affection. Now, something like desperation lived in her eyes. "Sandra, dear," Eleanor began, her voice unsteady, "I need to speak with you about tonight." Sandra gestured toward a chair, her own expression neutral. "Of course, Eleanor. Please sit." "I won't be long." Eleanor remained standing, as if sitting would commit her to a conversation she hoped to avoid. "I want you to stop this. Convince Robert to cancel the broadcast. Tell him you'll discuss everything privately. Tell him whatever he needs to hear." Sandra studied her mother-in-law with genuine curiosity. In 23 years, Eleanor had never intervened in her son's behavior, not when he belittled Sandra at dinner parties, not when he dismissed her opinions in front of guests, not when his treatment crossed from coldness into cruelty. This sudden concern was unprecedented. "Why, Eleanor?" Sandra asked softly. "What are you afraid of?" Eleanor's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Tears spilled down cheeks that had endured decades of strategic Botox, tracing unfamiliar paths across artificially smooth skin. Her lips trembled with words she couldn't quite form. "Some secrets should stay buried," she finally whispered. "Some truths destroy more than they reveal. Please, Sandra, for the sake of this family." Sandra let the silence stretch between them, watching Eleanor's desperation with something approaching sympathy. This woman had spent 53 years protecting a lie. She had watched her legitimate son, Harold's actual biological child, be tormented by the son born of her affair, never intervening because intervention would require truth. "Perhaps you're right," Sandra said gently. "Perhaps some secrets should stay buried. But I didn't bury them, Eleanor, and I'm not the one digging them up." Understanding dawned slowly in Eleanor's eyes, the recognition that Sandra knew, that she had always known, that tonight's revelation was not accident but inevitability. "How long?" Eleanor breathed. "Long enough." Eleanor left without another word, her elegant departure undermined by the shaking of her hands and the tears she no longer tried to hide. Sandra watched her go, feeling something that might have been compassion for a woman about to lose everything she'd spent a lifetime protecting. But compassion did not equal mercy. Tonight would proceed as planned. Studio lights hummed with electrical intensity as the audience filed into their seats. 300 people, selected from thousands of applicants, settled into the carefully arranged seating that would provide reaction shots throughout the broadcast. Camera operators performed final checks. Sound technicians monitored audio levels. The host, Marcus Webb, a veteran of primetime specials who had built his career on other people's drama, reviewed his notes one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are live in 5 minutes," a production assistant announced. "Please silence all cell phones. Please remain in your seats during commercial breaks. And please," she smiled with practiced warmth, "give us authentic reactions. This is a moment of truth for one American family, and your responses are part of the story." Robert and Sandra were escorted to their respective podiums through separate entrances, ensuring no unscripted confrontation before cameras rolled. Robert walked with the confident stride of a man ascending to victory, nodding at audience members as if accepting applause. Sandra walked with measured grace, her expression carrying exactly the quiet hurt she had practiced, the wrongly accused wife maintaining dignity despite her husband's cruelty. The broadcast opened with a montage: Ashford Pharmaceuticals headquarters, the family estate, Robert and Sandra's wedding photos from 23 years ago. Marcus Webb's voiceover established the narrative with practiced gravity. The Ashford family has represented American success for 4 decades, but behind the wealth and prestige, secrets have been brewing. Tonight, one man demands the truth, whatever that truth might be. This is the truth revealed. Robert presented his case with polished confidence. He described Sandra's suspicious behavior in damning detail, the secretive phone calls she tried to hide, her emotional distance that had grown over years, the text messages he had accidentally discovered that suggested connections beyond their marriage. "I'm not a jealous man," Robert said, his voice carrying wounded sincerity. "But when the evidence becomes undeniable, a husband has the right to know. A father has the right to know if his children are truly his." Sandra's rebuttal was minimal by design. She denied the affair quietly, without elaboration. She offered no alternative explanations, no character witnesses, no passionate defense of her faithfulness. She appeared beaten, a woman who had accepted that her husband's accusations would destroy her, regardless of truth. The audience, reading her silence as confirmation of guilt, shifted their sympathy toward Robert. He was playing the wronged husband perfectly, and she was giving him exactly what he needed. Dr. Patricia Coleman took the stage carrying the envelope that would determine everything. Her expression was professionally neutral, revealing nothing of the results she had reviewed hours earlier, results that had required immediate consultation with network lawyers and crisis management teams. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford," she began, "the results of your DNA analysis are complete. Before I reveal them, I want to remind everyone that DNA testing is a powerful tool that can uncover more than we anticipate. Genetic analysis sometimes reveals unexpected information beyond the specific questions we ask." Robert dismissed the preamble with an impatient wave. "Just read the results. Let's end this." The envelope opened. Paper unfolded, and the world Robert Ashford had known for 52 years ceased to exist. Paramedics materialized within seconds of Robert's collapse. Their presence a precaution, the network had arranged for exactly this type of emergency. They swarmed the stage, blocking camera angles while production crews scrambled to maintain broadcast integrity. "Cut to commercial," the director commanded. "Now. Cut now." But the damage was already complete. Audience members had captured the moment on smartphones that should have been silenced. Within minutes, footage flooded social media. Robert's face frozen in horror, his knees buckling, his body crumpling to the stage floor while Sandra sat motionless beside him. Hashed Ashford shock replaced Ashford scandal with viral velocity. The narrative inverted so completely that previous posts condemning Sandra now read as embarrassing premature judgment. Accounts that had declared her guilty hours earlier deleted their tweets or pivoted to analysis of this shocking development. "Robert Ashford isn't the wronged husband," one commentator declared on live television, summarizing the reversal. "He's the illegitimate son who just discovered his entire identity is built on a lie, and he did it to himself on national television while trying to humiliate his wife." Sandra was escorted from the studio by security personnel who shielded her from the chaos of cameras and shouted questions. She said nothing. Not a word of triumph, not a statement of vindication, not even acknowledgement of the reporters calling her name. Her silence now read completely differently than it had hours before. This was not the silence of guilt. This was the silence of dignity. A wrongly accused woman who had endured her husband's public cruelty with grace, who had known the truth all along but refused to sink to his level. Public sympathy shifted with the violence of a tidal wave reversing course. Robert regained consciousness in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and institutional efficiency. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. An IV dripped saline into his arm. His lawyer Benjamin stood near the door, phone pressed to his ear, fielding calls from media outlets desperate for statements. Robert's publicist, Victoria, stood closer, her expression the careful blankness of someone delivering catastrophic news. "What happened?" Robert's voice cracked, the arrogance temporarily stripped by genuine confusion. "The test? There must be a mistake. The results are wrong." "The results have been verified by 3 independent laboratories," Victoria said quietly. "The network is preparing a follow-up segment for tomorrow's news cycle. Legal is reviewing defamation exposure, and Robert," she paused, choosing words carefully, "the story is everywhere, every major outlet, international coverage. Social media is not favorable." Robert struggled to sit up, his mind still refusing to process the information. "Harold Ashford is my father. He raised me. He gave me everything. This is a conspiracy. Someone tampered with the samples." "No one tampered with anything," Benjamin interrupted, pocketing his phone. "The DNA is conclusive, Robert. Harold Ashford is not your biological father. The genetic markers are unambiguous." The words hung in the sterile air, impossible to accept and impossible to deny. Robert's first coherent thought, once the shock began to recede, was not about identity or family or the lies he had built his life upon. It was about money. "The will," he whispered. "Father's will specifies biological descendants." Benjamin nodded slowly, his expression confirming Robert's worst fear. "We'll need to discuss legal options, but the language is explicit. Without biological connection to Harold Ashford, your claim to the inheritance faces significant challenges." Significant challenges? Robert's voice rose toward hysteria. "I've run that company for 15 years. I've been the heir for my entire life. Everyone knows I'm Harold Ashford's son." "Everyone knew," Victoria corrected gently. Past tense. Now everyone knows something different. Robert fell back against the hospital pillow, staring at the ceiling as the full magnitude of what he had done to himself began to crystallize. He had wanted to destroy Sandra publicly. Instead, he had destroyed himself. Eleanor Ashford arrived at the hospital at midnight, escorted by a driver who had navigated through crowds of reporters camped outside the entrance. She had aged decades in the hours since the broadcast, her careful composure shattered, her elegant facade crumbled beyond repair. Robert was alone in his room, having dismissed lawyers and publicists and anyone else who reminded him that the world outside was watching his destruction with fascinated horror. He sat in the hospital bed, still wearing the expensive suit from the broadcast, his eyes fixed on a muted television, cycling through coverage of his humiliation. Eleanor's entrance brought something Robert had never seen from his mother, genuine, unfiltered emotion. Mother. His voice cracked on the word, carrying decades of assumptions now revealed as illusions. "Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me the DNA was corrupted somehow. Tell me. It's not a mistake." Eleanor's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. She crossed to a chair beside his bed and sat heavily, as if her legs could no longer support the weight of secrets finally exposed. "It's all true, Robert. Every word." Robert's hands trembled as he gripped the hospital blanket. "Who is my real father?" The question hung between them, 52 years of lies crystallizing into this single devastating inquiry. Eleanor closed her eyes, and when she spoke, the words came slowly, excavated from the buried places where she had hidden her shame for more than half a century. His name was Victor Castellano. He was a businessman from Philadelphia. Imports and exports, legitimate interests, charismatic beyond measure. She paused, lost momentarily in memories she had spent decades suppressing. "Your father and I, Harold and I, we were struggling. The company was consuming him. We barely spoke. We certainly didn't touch. I felt invisible in my own marriage." "So you had an affair. So I had an affair." Eleanor's confirmation carried no defense, no justification, simple acknowledgement of truth. "Victor made me feel seen, alive, wanted. For 4 months, I was someone other than Harold Ashford's neglected wife. And then you got pregnant." "And then I got pregnant." Eleanor opened her eyes, meeting her son's gaze with tears streaming freely. "I ended the affair immediately. Victor never knew. He died 15 years ago without ever learning he had a son. I told myself I would take the secret to my grave." Robert processed this information with the slow comprehension of a man watching his foundation dissolve. "Does Harold know?" Eleanor's response shattered what remained of Robert's assumptions. "He's always known." The words landed like physical blows. Robert recoiled, confusion and betrayal warring across his features. "What do you mean he's always known? How is that possible?" "You were 3 years old," Eleanor explained, her voice steadying as she recounted events she had replayed in memory countless times. "We took you to the hospital for a minor procedure, an ear infection that needed drainage. The doctors typed your blood as a precaution. Your blood type was incompatible with Harold's. Medically impossible if he were your biological father. He confronted you?" "That night, after you were asleep." Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. "I had never seen him so angry or so hurt. I thought he would leave me. I thought he would expose everything, take the company away, destroy my reputation and yours in the process. But he didn't. He didn't." Eleanor's voice carried wonder, even now, at the choice Harold had made. "He cried, Robert. Your father, the man you know as your father, sat in his study and cried like a child, and then he made a decision. He chose to stay. He chose to raise you as his own son. He chose to love you despite knowing you carried another man's blood." Robert struggled to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he understood about Harold Ashford, the distant, demanding patriarch who had molded Robert into his image. This man had known the truth for nearly 50 years and never wavered in his commitment. Why? Robert whispered. Why would he do that? Because he loved me. Because he had already bonded with you. 3 years of midnight feedings and first steps and watching you sleep. Eleanor's voice broke slightly. Because Harold Ashford, for all his faults, understood that family is more than genetics. He chose to be your father, Robert. Every single day for 50 years, he chose you. The silence that followed stretched into something vast and terrible. Robert's mind raced through implications. The inheritance, the will, the life he had lived as an imposter without knowing it. Does Daniel know? Eleanor shook her head. Only Harold and I knew. We swore to each other the secret would die with us. A bitter laugh escaped her. And now the whole world knows instead. Robert sank back against his pillows, staring at the ceiling as reality reconfigured itself into something unrecognizable. His entire claim to the Ashford Empire rested on a biological connection that didn't exist. The name he had worn like armor, the birthright he had wielded like a weapon, all of it was illusion. And Daniel, the bastard Robert had tormented for 40 years, was Harold's only legitimate heir. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. 3 days after the broadcast, Robert's lawyers delivered the confirmation he had dreaded. They gathered in a conference room at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. 6 attorneys in identical dark suits, their expressions carefully neutral as they presented documents that would dismantle Robert's future. We've reviewed Harold Ashford's will extensively, Benjamin Cross began, spreading papers across the mahogany table. The relevant section is explicit. Quote, my estate, including all holdings in Ashford Pharmaceuticals, shall pass to my biological descendants in accordance with standard inheritance protocols. There must be interpretation room, Robert insisted, his voice carrying desperation poorly disguised as confidence. I've been treated as his son for my entire life. Legal precedent must account for. We've researched extensively, another attorney interrupted. There are cases where courts have considered functional parenthood or equitable adoption arguments. However, Harold's will is unusually specific. The phrase biological descendants appears 7 times throughout the document. It's not ambiguous language, it's deliberate precision. When was the will last updated? The lawyers exchanged glances before Benjamin answered. 3 months ago. Harold worked with his attorneys to revise several provisions, including the specific biological descendants language you're questioning. Robert's blood ran cold. 3 months ago. After decades of a will that might have used more ambiguous terminology, Harold had recently updated it with language that explicitly excluded non-biological heirs. He knew this would come out, Robert realized aloud. He updated the will because he knew somehow. We can't speculate about Mr. Ashford Sr.'s motivations, Benjamin said carefully. What we can tell you is that challenging the will would require proving either that Harold lacked mental capacity when he signed it, which his attending physicians will contradict, or that he was unduly influenced by outside parties. Daniel influenced him. Mr. Mercer had minimal contact with Harold in the months before the will update. And Robert, Benjamin paused, choosing his next words with visible care. Pursuing that argument would require public litigation that would extend your media exposure significantly. The story would remain in the news cycle for months, possibly years. The implication was clear. Robert could fight and keep his humiliation alive indefinitely, or he could accept defeat and hope the public's attention eventually moved elsewhere. Neither option offered anything resembling victory. What exactly does Daniel inherit? Robert asked, his voice hollow. Benjamin consulted his documents. Controlling interest in Ashford Pharmaceuticals, the family estate in Connecticut, investment portfolios valued at approximately $1.8 billion, various properties including the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons residence, and a villa in Tuscany. Essentially, he looked up everything. And what do I get? You're not mentioned in the will, Robert. As a non-biological descendant, you have no standing under its current terms. The word struck with physical force. Robert had spent his entire life as Harold Ashford's heir, preparing for the moment when his father's empire would become his own. He had run the company, made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, positioned himself as the natural successor to everything Harold had built. Now he would receive nothing. Less than nothing. He would watch Daniel Mercer, the man he had spent 4 decades tormenting as an inferior, claim everything Robert had believed was rightfully his. Daniel Mercer sat in his modest Brooklyn apartment, watching his phone screen illuminate with incoming calls he had no intention of answering. Media outlets, lawyers, financial advisors, estranged relatives who had never acknowledged his existence, all suddenly desperate to connect with the man who had just become one of America's wealthiest citizens. The apartment itself told the story of Daniel's life before this moment. Comfortable but not lavish, clean lines, secondhand furniture chosen for function rather than status, bookshelves filled with titles on business strategy he had never been permitted to implement at Ashford Pharmaceuticals. A space designed for a man who had accepted his place on the margins and built a quiet dignity within those confines. Maria, his wife of 15 years, found him sitting on their secondhand sofa, staring at the muted television coverage of his sudden fortune with an expression she couldn't quite decode. "Daniel?" She sat beside him, taking his hand. "Are you okay?" The question seemed to puzzle him, as if he were still determining the answer himself. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," he admitted. "I've spent 40 years being reminded that I was lesser, that I didn't fully belong, that my blood was a stain on the Ashford name rather than a connection to it. And now you're the only legitimate heir. And now I'm the only legitimate heir." Daniel laughed, a sound carrying more confusion than humor. "Robert called me bastard so many times I stopped hearing it as an insult. It just became my name when he was around. The bastard, the mistake, the proof of Harold's weakness." "He can't call you that anymore." "No," Daniel agreed. "Now he's the one who doesn't belong. He's the product of Eleanor's affair, not Harold's. Everything he used to diminish me, every insult, every blocked promotion, every public humiliation at family gatherings, it was all based on a lie he believed as completely as I did." Maria waited, recognizing that her husband was processing something too large for easy articulation. "I thought I would feel satisfied," Daniel continued. "I thought if the truth ever came out, if Robert ever faced consequences for how he treated me, I would feel vindicated, justified, something like joy. But you don't? I feel empty." Daniel turned to meet her eyes. 40 years of cruelty, and now that hierarchy has collapsed, and all I feel is nothing. Like the structure I built my identity against has suddenly vanished, and I don't know who I am without it. Maria squeezed his hand. "You're the same man you were before the broadcast. Kind, patient, good. The money and the name don't change that. Don't they?" Daniel's voice carried genuine uncertainty. "I'm about to become one of the wealthiest men in America. Everyone who ignored me will suddenly want my attention. Everyone who dismissed me will suddenly find me fascinating. How do I know what's genuine when everything about how people treat me is about to change?" "You know me," Maria said simply. "I'm still the woman who married a middle manager in the logistics division because he made me laugh and never treated waiters like servants. Start there." Daniel smiled, the first genuine expression since the broadcast. I need to talk to Harold before it's too late." The Ashford estate felt different as Daniel approached it for the first time as its future owner. The manicured grounds, the sweeping driveway, the Georgian architecture that had always seemed designed to remind him of his exclusion, all of it now carried a strange weight of belonging. Eleanor tried to block his entrance at the door, her face puffy from days of crying, her composure irreparably shattered. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling between hostility and despair. "Harold is too weak for visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Daniel replied quietly. "I'm his son, his only biological son, and I'd like to see my father before he dies." The words carried no cruelty, but their truth was undeniable. Eleanor stepped aside, unable to formulate a response that could challenge his claim. Daniel found Harold in the master bedroom, attended by a nurse who discreetly withdrew upon his entrance. The old man had aged dramatically since Daniel's last visit, the cancer accelerating its work, stealing weight and color and vitality with brutal efficiency. But Harold's eyes remained sharp, and they fixed on Daniel with an expression carrying something Daniel had never seen directed at him before: unguarded acknowledgement. You came, Harold whispered. I came. Daniel pulled a chair beside the bed, settling into it with movements he forced himself to keep slow and steady. This man, this dying patriarch who had given Daniel just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive, was his father in ways that now carried legal and financial weight. I assume you've heard everything, Harold continued. The entire world has heard everything. Harold coughed, a wet, rattling sound that suggested his lungs were failing along with everything else. I should have told you years ago. Should have told you that Robert wasn't, that you were my only. Why didn't you? The question Daniel had carried for decades finally had space to exist. Why had Harold kept him at arm's length? Why had he allowed Robert's cruelty? Why had he built a lie that positioned his legitimate son as inferior while protecting the product of his wife's affair? Because Eleanor begged me, Harold admitted. When I discovered the truth about Robert, when I realized he wasn't mine, she was terrified I would leave her, expose her, destroy our family publicly. She made me promise to protect Robert's position, to never reveal the truth. So you sacrificed me instead. Harold's eyes glistened with tears that seemed to cost him enormous effort. I told myself it was different, that you had the trust fund, the position in the company, enough to build a life. I told myself Robert would mature, would treat you better eventually. I told myself. His voice broke. I told myself 1,000 lies to avoid confronting the truth of what I was doing. You let him torment me for 40 years, Daniel said, his voice steady but carrying undertones of grief he couldn't fully suppress. You sat at family dinners while he called me bastard in front of everyone. You attended board meetings where he blocked my promotions. You watched him work to destroy me, and you did nothing. I did nothing, Harold confirmed, and I will die with that failure. There's no excuse, Daniel. There's no explanation that makes it acceptable. I prioritized a lie over my own son, and I can never undo that harm. Daniel sat with his father's confession, allowing its weight to settle across the years of pain it attempted to address. There was no response adequate to 4 decades of paternal failure. No words that could heal wounds carved so deeply into his understanding of self. I don't want your money, Daniel finally said. I never did. Harold's confusion was evident. The inheritance. I'll accept the inheritance because you structured the will to give it to me, and rejecting it would create legal chaos that would harm the company's employees, but I'm not here for money. Daniel leaned forward, meeting his father's fading gaze. I'm here because I spent my whole life wanting one thing from you. Just one thing. What? I wanted you to see me, not as a complication to be managed, not as a scandal to be contained, as your son. Daniel's voice carried no anger, only the profound sadness of a child who had waited too long for something that should have been given freely. I wanted you to see me. Tears spilled freely down Harold's weathered cheeks, tracing paths through wrinkles carved by decades of stress and secrets. His hand, trembling, spotted with age, reached toward Daniel. I see you now, Harold whispered. I'm sorry it took dying to open my eyes. Daniel took his father's hand, holding it gently as the old man's breath rattled and steadied. They sat together in silence, father and son, finally connected without the barriers of lies and positioning and cowardice. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness might never come, but it was acknowledgement. And for Daniel, in this moment, acknowledgement was enough. Sandra filed for divorce 48 hours after the broadcast, timing her legal action with the precision of a chess master executing a long-planned combination. Rebecca Torres, her lawyer, had been retained 3 years earlier, one of Manhattan's most formidable family law attorneys, known for securing spectacular settlements through meticulous preparation and strategic aggression. Sandra had found her during a phase of research that Robert would never have suspected his stupid wife capable of conducting. The divorce petition was a masterwork of legal documentation. It cataloged 23 years of emotional abuse with clinical precision. Each allegation supported by evidence Sandra had gathered with the patience of someone who understood that wars were won through preparation, not passion. Financial records demonstrated Robert's controlling behavior. Sandra's allowance of $2,000 monthly, while Robert spent freely from accounts she was forbidden to access. Text messages preserved Robert's language patterns. Stupid, worthless, lucky I keep you around. The vocabulary of diminishment deployed so consistently it constituted psychological warfare. Staff testimony from current and former household employees described the dynamics they had witnessed. Robert's public belittling of Sandra at social events, his dismissal of her opinions on matters as trivial as dinner selections, his insistence on approving her clothing choices for public appearances. Medical records from a therapist Sandra had secretly consulted documented classic patterns of emotional abuse, providing clinical language for experiences that victims often struggled to articulate. And the prenuptial agreement, the document Robert had believed would protect him, was challenged on grounds of unconscionable conduct. The infidelity clause is irrelevant, Rebecca explained in her filing. Mrs. Ashford did not commit infidelity. Mr. Ashford publicly accused his wife of infidelity on national television without evidence, constituting defamation. His deliberate attempt to humiliate Mrs. Ashford before millions of viewers demonstrates cruelty that renders the prenuptial agreement unenforceable. Robert's legal team scrambled to respond, but they were fighting on terrain Sandra had prepared for years. Rebecca Torres sat across from Sandra in her corner office, reviewing documentation with growing amazement. The evidence folder, thick with financial records, correspondence, testimony statements, and medical evaluations, represented years of meticulous collection. "I've been practicing family law for 25 years, Rebecca said, setting down a sheaf of papers. "I have never seen a client this prepared. This isn't documentation. This is a case study in strategic evidence gathering." Sandra accepted the observation without false modesty. "Robert always underestimated me. He told me repeatedly that I was too stupid to understand his business dealings, too emotional to make rational decisions, too dependent on his support to survive without him." "When did you start planning?" 7 years ago. Sandra's voice carried no emotion, only the calm recitation of facts. He had returned from a board meeting and was ranting about some subordinate who had dared to question his judgment. He said, and I remember the exact words, "This is why women shouldn't run companies. You're all too stupid to understand real business." He was looking directly at me when he said it. That was your turning point. That was the moment I realized he would never change. Every time I hoped his behavior would improve, he proved me wrong. Every time I made excuses for his cruelty, he gave me new cruelty to excuse. So I stopped hoping, I stopped making excuses, and I started documenting. Rebecca nodded slowly. "And the DNA research, when did you discover the truth about Robert's parentage?" 3 years ago, pure accident initially. Sandra explained the genealogy website, the corporate health screening, the unexpected results that had connected Robert to the Castellano family rather than the Ashford line. Once I understood what I'd found, I investigated further. Private investigators, additional DNA testing using samples I collected without Robert's knowledge, historical research into Eleanor's past. You could have used this information years ago. Leverage in a divorce negotiation, ammunition if he tried to harm you. I considered every option, Sandra acknowledged, but using the information directly would have made me the aggressor. I would have been the scheming wife who exposed family secrets for personal gain. The narrative would have favored Robert, the wounded victim of his wife's manipulation. So you waited for him to expose the secret himself. Sandra smiled slightly, the expression of a chess player whose opponent had finally walked into the trap. My grandmother taught me the game when I was 7. She said the most elegant victories come from positioning, not attacking. You don't destroy your opponent. You create conditions where they destroy themselves. You wait. You prepare. And when they finally make the move you've anticipated, you simply let the consequences unfold. And if Robert had never demanded the DNA test, then I would have found another approach. I had contingency plans, scenarios where the truth might emerge through medical situations, legal requirements, genealogy trends, but I always suspected Robert's ego would do the work for me. His need to publicly humiliate me was predictable. I just had to wait for him to choose his moment. Rebecca studied her client with something approaching awe. You've been playing a 3-dimensional game while he was playing checkers. Robert never saw me as a threat, Sandra said. He never imagined I was capable of strategy, of patience, of planning. That blindness was my greatest advantage. He was so busy underestimating me that he never noticed I was positioning pieces around him. And now the endgame begins. Sandra controlled her public narrative with the same precision she had applied to her legal strategy. Where Robert had saturated media with interviews and accusations before the broadcast, Sandra emerged afterward with calculated restraint. She granted a single interview, a sit-down with a respected journalist known for thoughtful, sympathetic coverage of complex human stories. The setting was carefully chosen. Sandra's temporary apartment, modest and tasteful, filled with books and family photographs that suggested a woman of substance forced into difficult circumstances. She wore simple clothing, minimal makeup, the aesthetic of someone focused on healing rather than performance. "These past weeks have been the most difficult of my life," Sandra said, her voice carrying genuine emotion she had practiced till it appeared entirely unscripted. "Watching my husband accuse me of infidelity on national television, knowing I was innocent but unable to defend myself effectively, was devastating. You maintained remarkable composure during the broadcast," the journalist observed. "Many viewers noted that you seemed almost prepared for the outcome." Sandra's pause was calibrated to perfection, long enough to suggest careful consideration, short enough to avoid appearing evasive. "I had made peace with my husband's cruelty years ago. When you live with someone who constantly diminishes you, you develop coping mechanisms, emotional armor. I knew Robert would attack me publicly. I just didn't know exactly when or how." "Did you have any suspicion what the DNA results might reveal?" "None whatsoever." The lie emerged smoothly, indistinguishable from truth. "The revelation about Robert's parentage shocked me as much as anyone. My heart breaks for him, honestly. To discover your entire identity is built on a secret your parents kept for decades. I can't imagine that pain." "Yet you filed for divorce immediately afterward." "I filed for divorce because my marriage has been characterized by emotional abuse for years. The DNA revelation simply created circumstances where escape became possible. Robert's cruelty toward me was documented long before that broadcast." The interview continued for an hour, Sandra threading narratives of victimhood and dignity with expert precision. She spoke of enduring in silence, of protecting her children, of hoping, always hoping, that her husband would change. She mentioned nothing about the genealogy research, nothing about the years of preparation, nothing about knowing the broadcast would destroy Robert before he ever demanded it. The public embraced her as a survivor. Domestic abuse advocates rallied to her cause. Speaking invitations materialized, book deals were offered. Sandra declined them all, for now. Timing mattered. The divorce trial was still ahead, and public perception would influence outcomes in ways no legal strategy could fully control. She was not finished positioning pieces. The endgame had more moves to play.